Chapter 91 of The Wanderer, or Female Difficulties. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wanderer, or Female Difficulties, by Fanny Burney. Chapter 91. Juliet, left alone, again vented her full heart by tears. Happiness never seemed within her reach, but to make her feel more severely the hard necessity that it must be resigned. All her tenderest affections had been delighted, and her most ardent wishes surpassed, in being recognized as his niece by a man of so much worth, honour, and benevolence as the Admiral. And her heart had been yet more exquisitely touched, by acknowledged affinity with so sweet a character as that of Lady Aurora. Her portion, by the duplicate codicil, flattered and gave dignity to her softest feelings. Nevertheless, the cruelty of her situation was in nothing altered. The danger of the bishop was still the same. The same, therefore, was her duty. Even for deliberation she allowed herself no choice, save whether to confess to the Admiral the dreadful nature of her call to the Continent, or to go thither simply as a thing of course, to join her husband. For the latter, his approvance was declared. For the former, even his consent might be withdrawn. To spare, therefore, to his kind heart the unavailing knowledge of her misery, and to herself the useless conflicts that might ensue from the discovery, she ultimately decided to set out upon her voyage, with her story and misfortunes unrevealed. This plan determined upon, she struggled to fortify her mind for its execution, by endeavouring to consider as her husband the man to whom, in any manner, she had given her hand, since so only could she seek to check the disgust with which she shrunk from him as her deadliest foe. She remembered, and even sought to call back, the terrific scruples with which she had been seized, when, while striving to escape, she heard him assert that she was his wife, and felt powerless to disavow his claim. Triumphant, menacing, and ferocious, she had fled him without hesitation, though not completely without doubt. But when she beheld him seized, in custody, and heard him call her husband, and saw herself considered as his wife, duty for that horrible instant seemed in his favour; and, had not Sir Jaspar summoned her by her maiden name, to attend her own nearest relations, all her resistance had been subdued, by an overwhelming dread that to resist might possibly be wrong. Recollection, also, told her that, at the epoch when, with whatever misery she had suffered him to take her hand, no mental reservation had prepared for future flight and disavowal. She laboured, therefore, now, to plead to herself the vows which she had listened to, though she had not pronounced, and to animate her sacrifice by the terror of perjury. Nevertheless, all these virtuous arguments against her own freedom were insufficient to convince her that her marriage was valid. The violent constraint, the forced rites, the interrupted ceremony, the omission of every religious form, no priest, no church to sanctify even appearances. 'No!' she cried, 'no! I am not his wife! Even were it my wish, even were he all I prize upon earth, still I should fly him till we were joined by holier bands. Nevertheless, for the bishop I meant the sacrifice; and, since so only he can be preserved, for the bishop I must myself invite its more solemn ratification.' Satisfied that this line of conduct, while dictated by tender gratitude, was confirmed by severer justice, she would not trust herself again with the sight of Lady Aurora, till measures were irreversibly taken for her departure; and upon the return of the Admiral from his walk, she communicated to him, though without any explanation, her urgent desire to make the voyage with all possible expedition. The Admiral, persuaded that her haste was to soften the harsh treatment of a husband who had inveigled her into marriage by flattery and falsehood, forbore either questions or comments, though he looked at her with commiseration, often shaking his head, with an expression that implied, "What pity to have thrown yourself thus away!" His high notions, nevertheless, of conjugal prerogative, made him approve and second her design; and saying that he saw nothing gained by delay, but breeding more bad blood, he told her that he would conduct her to himself the next morning, and stay with her till he could procure her a proper passage, engaging to present her wherewithal to ascertain for her a good and hearty reception, with an assurance to her husband that she should, at any time, have the same sum, only for fetching it in person. This promising opening to occasional reunions, gave her, now, more fortitude for announcing to her gentle sister the fixed approaching separation. But though these were softening circumstances to their parting, Lady Aurora heard the decision with despair; and though the discovery of an uncle, a protector, in so excellent a man as the Admiral, offered a prospect of solid comfort, still she could dwell only upon the forced ties, the unnatural connexion, and the brutal character to which her unhappy sister must be the victim. Each seeking, nevertheless, to console the other, though each, herself, was inconsolable, they passed together the rest of the melancholy yet precious day, uninterrupted by the Admiral, who was engaged to dine out in the neighbourhood, or even by Mrs Howel, who acquiesced, perforce, to the pleadings of Lady Aurora, in suffering her ladyship to remain in her own room with Juliet. They engaged to meet again by daybreak the next morning, though to meet but to part. The next morning, however, when summoned to a post chaise by the Admiral, the courage of Juliet, for so dreadful a leave taking, failed; and, committing to paper a few piercingly tender words, she determined to write, more at length, all the consolation that she could suggest from the first stage. But when, in speechless grief, she would have felled her little billet in the anteroom, she found Lady Aurora's woman already in attendance, and heard that Lady Aurora, also, was risen and dressed. She feared, therefore, now, that an evasion might rather aggravate than spare affliction to her beloved sister, and, repressing her own feelings, entered the chamber. Lady Aurora, who had scarcely closed her eyes all night, had now, in the fancied security of a meeting, from having placed her maid as a sentinel, just dropt asleep. Her pale cheeks, and the movement of sorrow still quivering upon her lips, shewed that she had been weeping, when overpowering fatigue had induced a short slumber. Juliet, in looking at her, thought she contemplated an angel. The touching innocence of her countenance, the sweetness which no sadness could destroy, the grief exempt from impatience, and the air of purity that overspread her whole face, and seemed breathing round her whole form, inspired Juliet, for a few moments, with ideas too sublime for mere sublunary sorrow. She knelt, with tender reverence, by her side, inwardly ejaculating, "Sleep on, my angel sister! Recruit your harassed spirits, and wake not yet to the woes of your hapless Juliet." Then, placing gently upon her bosom the written farewell, she softly kissed the hem of her garments, and glided from the room. She made a sign to the maid, for she had no power of utterance, not to awaken her lady, and hurried down stairs to join the Admiral, attended by the faithful Ambrose. She was spared offering any apologies for detaining her uncle, by finding him preparing to step down to the beach with a spying glass, without which he never stirred a step, to take a view, before they set off, of a sail, which his servant, an old seaman, had just brought him word was in sight. He helped her, therefore, into the chaise, begging her patience for a few minutes. Juliet was not sorry to seize this interval for returning to the anteroom, to learn whether Lady Aurora were awake, and by her resignation or emotion, to judge whether a parting embrace would prove baneful or soothing. As she was re-entering the house, a vociferous cry of "Stop! Stop!" issued from a carriage that was driving past. She went on, desiring Ambrose to give her notice when the Admiral came back, but had not yet reached the gallery, when the stairs were rapidly ascended by two or more persons, one of which encircled her in his arms. She shrieked with sudden horror and despair, strenuously striving to disengage herself, though persuaded that the only person who would dare thus to assail her, was him to whom she was intentionally resigning her destiny. But her instinctive resistance was short. A voice that spoke love and sweetness exclaimed, "Miss Ellis! Sweet, lovely Miss Ellis! You are then my sister!" "Ah, heavens! Kind heaven!" cried the delighted Juliet. "Is it you, Lord Melbury? And will you, and thus kindly own me?" "Own? I am proud of you! My other sister alone can be as dear to me. What two incomparable creatures has heaven bestowed upon me for my sisters! How hard I must work not to disgrace them! And I will work hard too. I will not see two such treasures, so near to me, and so dear to me, hold down their sweet heads with shame for their brother. Come with me, then, my new sister. You need not fear to trust yourself with me now. Come, for I have something to say that we must talk over together alone." Putting, then, her willing arm within his, he eagerly conducted her down stairs, made her pass by the astonished Ambrose, at whom she nodded and smiled in the fulness of her contentment, and led her towards the beach, her heart exulting, and her eyes glistening with tender joy, even while every nerve was affected, and all her feelings were tortured, by a dread of quick approaching separation and misery. "I am come," cried he, when they were at a little distance from the houses, "to take the most prompt advantage of my brotherly character. I have travelled all night not to lose a moment in laying my scheme before you." "What kindness! Oh, my lord! And where did you hear? Where did Sir Jasper's letter reach you?" "Sir Jasper? I have received no letter from Sir Jasper. I have seen no Sir Jasper." "How, then, is it possible you can know?" "Oho! You think you have no friend, then, but Sir Jasper? And you suppose, perhaps, that you have no admirer but Sir Jasper?" "I am sure, at least, there is no other person to whom I have revealed my name." "Then he must have betrayed it to some other himself, my sweet sister. For 'tis not from him I have had my intelligence. Be less sure, therefore, for the future, of an old man, and trust a younger one more willingly. However, there is no time now for raillery. A messenger is waiting the result of our conference. I am fully informed, my precious sister, of your terrible situation. I will not stop now to execrate your infernal pursuer, though he will not lose my execrations by the delay. I know, too, your sublime resolution to save our dear guardian, for yours is ours, that good and reverend bishop, and to look upon yourself to be tied up as a bondwoman till you are formally released from those foul shackles. Do I state the case right?" "Oh, far, far too accurately! And even now, at a moment so blessed, I must tear myself away, by my own will, with whatever horror, from the sweetest of sisters, from you, my kindest brother, and from the most benevolent of uncles, by a separation 1,000 times more dreadful than any death." "Take comfort, sweet sister, take comfort, loveliest Miss Ellis, for I can't help calling you Miss Ellis now and then a little while longer. I have a plan to make you free, to set you completely at liberty, and yet save that excellent bishop." "Oh, my lord! How heavenly an idea! But how impossible!" "Not at all. 'Tis the easiest thing in the world. Only hear me. That wretch who claims you shall have the portion he demands, the £6,000, immediately upon signing your release, sending over the promissory note of Lord Denmeath, and delivering your noble bishop into the hands of the person who shall carry over the money, which, however, shall only be paid at some frontier town, whence the bishop may come instantly hither.' Struck with rapturous surprise, Juliet scarcely restrained herself from falling at his feet. She pressed his arm, she kissed the edge of his coat, and while striving, inarticulately, to call for blessings upon his head, burst into a passion of tears, though tears of ecstatic joy, that nearly deprived her of respiration. 'My sister! my dear sister!' tenderly cried Lord Melbury, 'how ashamed you make me! Could you then expect less? What a poor opinion you have entertained of your poor brother! I give you nothing. I merely agree that you shall possess what is your due. Know you not that you are entitled to 30,000 pounds from our estate? To the same fortune that has been settled upon Aurora? 'Tis from your own portion only, my dear sister, that this 6,000 will be sunk.'
'Can you, then, generous, generous Lord Melbury, can you see thus, without regret, without murmur, so capital a sum suddenly and unexpectedly torn from you?'
'I have not yet enjoyed it, my dear sister. I shall not therefore miss it. But if I had possessed it always, should I not be paid, 10,000,000 of times paid, by finding such a new sister? I shall be proud to shew the whole world I know how to prize such a relation. And I will not have them think me such a mere boy, because I am still rather young, as to be at a loss how to act by myself. I shall not, therefore, consult my uncle, for I am determined not to be ruled by him. I will solemnly bind myself to pay your whole fortune the moment I am of age. It is my duty, and my pride, and at the same time my delight, to spare your delicacy, as well as my own character, and our dear father's memory, any process or any dispute.' Then, opening his arms, with design to embrace her, but checking himself upon recollecting that he might be observed, he animatedly added, 'Yes, my dear father, I will shew how I cherish your memory, by my care of your eldest born, by my care of her interests, her safety, and her happiness. As to her honour,' he added, with a conscious smile, 'she has shewn me that she knows how to be its guardian herself.' The grateful Juliet frankly acknowledged, that both the thought and the wish had frequently occurred to her, of rescuing the bishop, through her portion, without herself; but she had been utterly powerless to raise it. She was under age, and uncertain whether her rights might ever be proved; and the 6,000 pounds proffered by Lord Denmeath, she was well aware, would never be accorded but to establish her as an alien. Her generous brother, by anticipating, as well as confirming her claims, alone could realize such a project. With sensations, then, of unmixed felicity, that seemed lifting her, while yet on earth, into heaven, she was flying to call for the participation of Lady Aurora, and of her uncle, in her joy, when Lord Melbury, stopping her, said, that all was not yet prepared for communication. 'You clearly,' he continued, 'agree to the scheme?'
'With transport!' she cried, 'and with eternal thankfulness.'
Without delay, then, he said they must appoint a person of trust, who knew the French language well, and to whom the whole history might be confided, to carry over the offer, and the money, and to bring back the bishop. 'And I have a friend,' he continued, 'now ready for the enterprise, one equally able and willing to claim the bishop, and to give undoubted security for the 6,000 pounds. Can you form any notion who such a man may be?' He looked at her gaily, yet with a scrutiny that made her blush. One person only could occur to her, but occurred with an alarming sense of impropriety in allowing him such an employment, that instantly dampened her high delight. She dropt her eyes, an unrepressed sigh broke from her heart, but secret consciousness hushed all enquiry into the truth of her conjecture. In silence, too, for a moment, Lord Melbury contemplated her. Struck with her sudden sadness, and uncertain to what it might be attributed, Affectionately then taking her hand, "I must come," he cried, "to the point, or my messenger will lose his patience. Proposals of marriage the most honourable have been made to me; such, my dear sister, as merit my best interest with you. The person is unexceptionable, high in mind, manners, and family, and has long been attached to you." Juliet here, with dignity, interrupted him.
My lord, I will not ask who this may be. I even beg not to be told. I can listen to no one. Till the bishop is released and safe, I hold myself merely to be his hostage; and, till my freedom, atrociously as it has been violated, shall be legally restored to me, I cannot but feel hurt, for I will not say offended where the intention is so kind, and so pure, that any proposals of any sort, and from any person, should be addressed to me.
Lord Melbury, prepared for expostulation, was beginning to reply, but she solemnly besought him not to involve her in any new conflicts. She then asked his permission to introduce him to her uncle, Admiral Powell, whom she desired to join upon the beach. "No, no," he answered, "other business, still more urgent, must have precedence." And holding both her hands, he insisted upon acquainting her that it was Mr Harleigh who had been his informant of her history and situation, and that she was the undoubted and legitimate daughter of Lord Granville; all which he had learnt from Sir Jasper Harrington. "And Mr Harleigh has begged my leave," continued his lordship, smiling, "though I am not, you may think, perhaps, very old for judging of such matters, to make his addresses to you. Now don't put yourself into that flutter till you hear how he arranged it, for he knows all your scruples, and reveres them; or, rather, he reveres you, my sweet sister, for your scruples we both think a little chimerical. Don't be angry at that; we honour you all the same for having them, and Mr Harleigh seems to adore you only the more. So I make no doubt as Aurora. And I too, my dear sister, only I can't see you sacrificed to them. But Mr Harleigh has found a way to reconcile all perplexities. He will save you, he says, in honour as well as in person; for the wretch shall still have the wife whom he married, if he will restore the bishop."
"What can you mean?"
"His 6,000 pounds, my dear sister. That sum in full he shall have; for that, as Harleigh says, is the wife that he married." Smiles now again, irresistibly, forced their way back to the face of Juliet, as she bowed her full concurrence to this observation. "Harleigh, therefore," continued Lord Melbury, "for this very reason, will go himself to make the arrangement, to the end that, if the wretch refuses to take the 6,000 without you, he may offer 1,000 or two over; for, enraged as he is to enrich such a scoundrel, he would rather endow him with your whole 30,000, and, for aught I know, with as much more of his own, than let you fall into his clutches." The eyes of Juliet again swam in tears.
"Noble, incomparable Harleigh!"
she irresistibly ejaculated; but checking herself,
"My lord," she said, "my thanks are still all that I can return to Mr Harleigh; yet I will not deny how much I am touched by his generosity; but I have insurmountable objections to this proposition. Now, indeed, I ought to cast upon any other the risks of an engagement which honour and conscience make sacred to myself."
"Poor Harleigh!" said Lord Melbury. "I have been but a bad advocate, he will think. You will at least see him." "See him?" "Yes, he came with me hither. 'Twas he descried you first, as you got out of the post chaise. He was accompanying me up the stairs, but he retreated. You will surely see him."
"Oh, my lord, no! Certainly not!"
"What? Not for a moment? Oh, that would be too barbarous." With these words he ran back to the town. Juliet called after him, but in vain. Her heart now beat high; it seemed throbbing through her bosom; but she bent her way towards the beach, to secure her safety by joining her uncle. She perceived him at some distance, in the midst of a small group, conspicuous from his height, his naval air and equipment, and his long spying glass, which he occasionally brandished, as he seemed questioning or haranguing the people around him. In a minute she was accosted by the old sailor, who was sent by his master to the chaise, in which he supposed his niece to be still waiting, to beg that she would not be impatient, because a boat being just come in, with a small handful of the enemy, his Honour was giving a look at the vessel, to see to its being wind and weather proof, to the end that her ladyship might take a sail in it. Juliet, though she answered, "Certainly, tell my uncle certainly," knew not what she heard, nor what she said, confused by fast approaching footsteps, which told her that she could not, now, either by going on, or by turning back, escape meeting Harleigh. Lord Melbury advanced first, and, willing to give Harleigh a moment to press his suit, good humouredly addressed the sailor, with inquiries of what was going forward upon the beach. Harleigh, having made a bow, which her averted eyes had not seen, drew back, distressed and irresolute, waiting to catch a look that might be his guide. But when, from the discourse of the sailor with Lord Melbury, he learnt the arrival of a small vessel from the Continent, which was destined immediately to return thither, he precipitately took his lordship by the arm, spoke to him a few words apart, and then flew forward to the strand. Juliet, disturbed by new fears, permitted her countenance to make inquiries which her tongue durst not pronounce; and Lord Melbury, who understood her, frankly said, "He is a man, sister, of 10,000. He will sail a race with you, and strive which shall get in first to save the bishop." Juliet felt thunderstruck. Harleigh seeking a passage in the very vessel which seemed pitched upon by her uncle for her own voyage! That they should go together was not to be thought of; but to suffer him to risk becoming the victim to her promise and her duties, was grief and shame and terror united. Her eyes affrightedly pursued him, till he entered into the group upon the strand, and her perturbation then was so extreme, that she felt inclined to forfeit, by one dauntless stroke, the delicacy which, as yet, had through life, been the prominent feature of her character, by darting on, openly to conjure him to return. But habits which have been formed upon principle, and embellished by self-approbation, withstand, upon the smallest reflection, every wish, and every feeling that would excite their violation. The idea, therefore, died in its birth, and she sought to compose her disordered spirits, by silent prayers for courage and resignation. With the most fraternal participation in her palpable distress, Lord Melbury endeavoured to offer her consolation, till the sailor, who had returned to the Admiral, came from him, a second time, to desire that she would hasten upon the beach. "To help his Honour, please your ladyship," said the merry tar, with a significant nod, "to a little French lingo, these monsieurs and their wives, if behaps they be'n't only their sweethearts, not over and above understanding his Honour." Juliet moved slowly on. The Admiral, used to more prompt obedience, came forward to hasten her, calling out, as soon as she was within hearing, "Please to wag a little nimbler, niece, for here are some outlandish gentry come over, that speak so fast, one after t'other, or else all at a time, each telling his own story, or, for aught I can make out, each telling the same thing one as t'other, that though I try my best to understand them, not being willing to dash them, I can't make out above one word in a dozen, if you take it upon an average, of what they say. However, though it is our duty to hold them all as our native enemies, and I shall never, God willing, see them in any other light, yet it would be unchristian not to lend them a hand, when they are chopfallen and sorrowful, and moreover consumedly out of cash. So if I can help them, I see no reason to the contrary, for my enemy in distress is my friend, because why? I was only his enemy to get the upper hand of him." Then, turning to Lord Melbury and Harleigh, "I hope," he added, "you won't think me wanting to my country, if, for the honour of old England, I give these poor half-starved souls a hearty meal of good roast beef, with the bumper of Dorchester ale and Devonshire cider, things which I conclude they have never yet tasted from their births to this hour, their own washy diet of soup, meagre, and salad, with which I would not fatten a sparrow, being what they are more naturally born to. And I shan't be sorry, I confess, to show the French we have a little politeness of our own, which by what I have often taken note, I rather surmise they hold to be a merchandise of their own monopoly. And so, if you think well of it, we'll tack about and give them an handsome invitation out of hand. For when a person stops to ponder before he does a good office, 'tis a sign he had full as lieve let it alone.
Juliet readily complied, though she could not readily speak. But what was her perturbation, the next moment, to see Harleigh vehemently break from the group by which he had been surrounded, rush precipitately forward to meet them, and singling out Lord Melbury, encircle his lordship in his arms, exclaiming, "My lord, my dear lord, your sister is free! I claim now your suffrage. Her brutal persecutor, convicted of heading a treasonable conspiracy in his own country, has paid the forfeit of his crimes. These passengers bring the tidings. My lord, my dear lord, your sister is free!"
Juliet, who heard, as it was meant that she should hear, this passionate address, felt suspended in all her faculties. Joy, in the first instant, sought precedence, but it was supplanted, in another moment, by tearful incredulity, and she stood motionless, speechless, scarcely conscious whether she were alive. An exclamation of "What's all this?" from the astonished Admiral, and a juvenile jump of unrestrained rapture from the transported Lord Melbury, brought Harleigh to himself. He felt confounded at the publicity and the abruptness of an address into which his ecstasy had surprised him; yet his satisfaction was too high for repentance, though he forced it to submit to some control. Suspension of sensibility could not, while there was life, be long allowed to Juliet, and the violence of her emotions, at its return, almost burst her bosom. What a change! Her feet tottered. She sustained her shaking frame against the Admiral. She believed herself in some new existence. Yet it was not unmixed joy that she experienced. There was something in the nature of her deliverance repulsive to joy, and the perturbed and tumultuous sensations which rushed into her breast seemed overpowering her strength, and almost shattering even her comprehension, till she was brought back painfully to herself, by an abrupt recollection of the uncertainty of the fate of the bishop, and shudderingly, she exclaimed, "Oh, if my revered guardian be not safe!" The wondering Admiral now, addressing Harleigh, gravely begged to be made acquainted, in plainer words, with the news that he reported. Not sorry to repeat what he wished should be fully comprehended, Harleigh, more composedly, recounted his intelligence, dwelling upon details which brought conviction of the seizure, the trial, and the execution of the execrable commissary. Juliet listened with rapt attention, but in proportion as her security in her own safety became confirmed, her poignant solicitude for that of the bishop increased, and again she exclaimed, "Oh, if my guardian has not escaped!" The Admiral, turning towards her rather austerely, said, "You must have had but a sad dog of a husband, niece Granville, to think only of an old priest, when you hear of his demise. However, to my seeming, though he might be but a rogue, a husband's a husband, and I don't much uphold a wife's not thinking of that. For if a woman may mutiny against her husband, there's an end of all discipline." Overwhelmed with shame, Juliet could attempt no self-defence, but Lord Melbury warmly assured the Admiral that his niece, Miss Granville, had never really been married; that a forced, interrupted, and unfinished lay ceremony had mockingly been celebrated, accompanied by circumstances atrocious, infamous, and cruel, and that the marriage could never have been valid, either in sight of the church or of her own conscience. The Admiral, with avidity and rising delight, sucked in this vindication, and then whispered to Juliet, "Pray, if I may make so free, who is this pretty boy that's got so much more insight into your affairs than I have? He's a very pretty boy, but I have no great taste to being put in the rear by him." Juliet was beginning to reply, when the Admiral called out, in a tone of some chagrin, "Now we are put off from doing the handsome thing, for here's the outlandish gentry coming among us before we have invited them. And now, you'll see, they'll always stand to it that they have the upper hand of us English in politeness, and I had rather have seen them all at the devil." Juliet, looking forward, perceived that they were approached by some strangers of a foreign appearance, but they detained not her attention. At one side, and somewhat aloof from them, a form caught her eye, reverend, aged, infirm. She started, and with almost agonized earnestness, advanced rapidly a few steps, then stopped abruptly to renew her examination, but presently, advancing again, called out, "Merciful Heaven!" and rushing on, with extended arms, and uncontrolled rapture, threw herself at the feet of the ancient traveller, and, embracing his knees, sobbed rather than articulated in French, "My guardian! My preserver! My more than father! I have not lost you, then?" Deeply affected, the man of years bent over and blessed her, mildly, yet fondly uttering in the same language, "My child! My Juliet! Do I then behold you again, my excellent child?" Then, helping her to rise, he added, "Your willing martyrdom is spared, my dear, my adopted daughter, and I, most mercifully, am spared its bitter infliction. Thanksgiving are all we have to offer, thanksgiving and humble prayers for universal peace." With anxious tenderness Juliet inquired for her benefactress, the Marchioness, and the Bishop for his niece Gabriella. The Marchioness was safe and well, awaiting a general reunion with her family. Gabriella, therefore, Juliet assured the Bishop, was now probably in her revered mother's arms. All further detail, whether of her own difficulties and sufferings, or of the perils and escapes of the Bishop, during their long separation, they mutually set apart for future communication, every evil, for the present, being sunk in gratitude at their meeting. Harleigh, who witnessed this scene with looks of love and joy, though not wholly unmixed with suffering impatience, forced himself to stand aloof. Lord Melbury, who had no feeling to hide, nor result to fear, gaily capered with unrestrained delight, and the Admiral, impressed with wonder, yet reverence, his hat in his hand, and his head high up in the air, waited patiently for a pause, and then, bowing to the ground, solemnly said, "Mr. Bishop, you are welcome to Old England, heartily welcome, Mr. Bishop. I ought to beg your pardon, perhaps, for speaking to you in English, but I have partly forgot my French, which, not to mince the matter, I never thought it much worth while to study. Little enough devising I should ever meet with a native-born Frenchman who was so honest a man, for it's pretty much our creed aboard, though I don't over and above uphold it myself, except as far as may belong to the sea service, to look upon your nation as little better than a cluster of rogues. However, we of the upper class, knowing that we are all alike in the main of God's workmanship, don't account it our duty to hold you so cheap. Therefore, Mr. Bishop, you are heartily welcome in Old England." The Bishop smiled, too wise to be offended, where he saw that no offence was meant. "But for all that," the Admiral continued, "I can't deny but I had as leave, to the full, if I had had my choice, that my niece should not have been brought up by the enemy. Yet I have always had a proper respect for a parson, whether he be of the true religion, or only a papist.
I hold nothing narrower than despising a man for his ignorance, especially when it's only of the apparatus, and not of the solid part. My niece, Mr. Bishop, will tell you the heads of what I say in your own proper dialect.'
The bishop answered that he perfectly understood English.
'I am cordially glad to hear it,' cried the Admiral, holding out his hand to him, 'for that's an item that gives me at once a good opinion of you. A man can be no common person who has a taste for our sterling sense, after being brought up to frothy compliments. And therefore, Mr. Bishop, I beg you to favour me with your company to eat a bit of roast beef with us at our lodging house, after our plain old English fashion, which, if I should make free to tell you it passes in my mind, I hold to be far wholesomer than your ragouts and fricandous, made up of oil and grease. But I only drop that as a matter of opinion, every nation having a right to like best what it can get cheapest. And if the rest of the passengers are people of a right way of thinking, I beg you to tell them I shall be glad of the favour of their company too.'
The bishop bowed, with an air of mild satisfaction.
'And I heartily wish you would give me an item, Monsieur the Bishop, how I might behave more handsomely; for, by what I can make out, you have been as kind to my niece as if you had been born on this side the Channel, which is no small compliment to make one born on the other side; and if ever I forget it, I wish I may go to the bottom; a thing we seamen, who understand something of those matters,' smiling, 'had full as lief leave alone.'
He then recommended to them all to stroll upon the sands for a further whet to their appetite, while he went himself to the lodging house, to see what could be had for a repast. End of chapter 91. Recording by Roxana Nazari. Chapter 92 of The Wanderer, or Female Difficulties. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wanderer, or Female Difficulties, by Fanny Burney. Chapter 92. Happy to second the benevolent scheme of the kind-hearted Admiral, the Bishop hastened to his fellow voyagers with the hospitable invitation. Juliet, in whom every feeling was awake to meet, to embrace, and to share her delight with Lady Aurora, would have followed; but Lord Melbury, to avoid, upon so interesting an occasion, any interruption from Mrs Howel, objected to returning to the hotel, and proposed being the messenger to fetch their sister. Juliet joyfully consented, and went to await them in the beautiful verdant recess, between two rocks, overlooking the vast ocean, with which she had already been so much charmed. No sooner, at this favourite spot, was Juliet alone, than, according to her wonted custom, she vented the fulness of her heart in pious acknowledgments. She had scarcely risen, when again, though without Lady Aurora, she saw Lord Melbury, yet not alone; he was arm in arm with Harleigh. 'My dear new sister,' he gaily cried, 'I go now for Aurora. We shall be here presently; but Mr Harleigh is so kind as to promise that he will stand without, as sentinel, to see that no one approaches nor disturbs you.' He was gone while yet speaking. The immediate impulse of Juliet urged her to remonstrance or flight; but it was the impulse of habit, not of reason. An instant, and a look of Harleigh, represented that the total change of her situation authorized, on all sides, a total change of conduct. Every part of her frame partook of the emotion with which this sudden consciousness beat at her heart, while her silence, her unresisting stay, and the sight of her varying complexion, thrilled to the soul of Harleigh, with an encouragement that he trembled with impatience to exchange for certainty. 'At last, may I,' he cried, 'under the sanction of a brother, presume upon obtaining a hearing with some little remittance of reserve, of mistrust?' Juliet dropt her head. 'Will not Miss Granville be more gracious than Miss Ellis has been?
Miss Granville can have no tie but what is voluntary. No hovering doubts, no chilling scruples, no fancied engagements.
A half sigh of too recent recollection heaved the breast of Juliet.
To plead, he continued, against all confidence, to freeze every avenue to sympathy, to repel or wound every rising hope. Miss Granville is wholly independent, mistress of her heart, mistress of herself. No, Mr Harleigh, no.
With quickness, though with gentleness, interrupted Juliet. Harleigh, momentarily startled, ventured to bend his head below her bonnet, and saw, then, that the blush which had visited, flown, and revisited her face, had fixed itself in the deepest tint upon her cheek. He gazed upon her in ecstatic silence, till looking up, and, for the first time, suffering her eyes willingly to meet his,
No, Mr Harleigh, no, she softly repeated, I am not so independent.
A smile then beamed over her features, so radiant, so embellishing, that Harleigh wondered he had ever thought her beautiful before, as she added,
Had I 100 hearts, 10,000 times you must have conquered them all.
Raptured self, now, is too cold a word, or too common a one, to give an adequate idea of the bliss of Harleigh. He took her no longer reluctant hand, and she felt upon it a burning tear as he pressed it to his lips. But his joy was unutterable. The change was so great, so sudden, and so exquisite, from all he most dreaded, to all he most desired, that language seemed futile for its expression, and to look at her without fearing to alarm or offend her, to meet with the softest assurance of partial favour, those eyes hitherto so coldly averted, to hold, unresisted, the fair hand that, but the moment before, it seemed sacrilege even to wish to touch. So only could he demonstrate the fulness of his transport, the fervour of his gratitude, the perfection of his felicity. In Juliet, though happiness was not less exalted, pleasure wore the chastened garb of moderation, even in the midst of a frankness that laid open her heart. Yet seeing his suit thus authorized by her brother, and certain of the approbation of the bishop, and of her uncle, to so equal and honourable an alliance, she indulged her soft propensities in his favour, by gently conceding avowals, that rewarded not alone his persevering constancy, but her own long and difficult forbearance.
Many efforts, many conflicts, she cried, in my cruel trials, I have certainly found harder, but none so distasteful, as the unremitting necessity of seeming always impenetrable, where most I was sensitive.
By sweetness such as this, cried Harleigh, you would almost persuade me to rejoice at a suspense that has nearly maddened me. Yet, could you have conceived the agony, the despair of my mind at your icy, relentless silence, not once to trust me as a friend, not one moment to confide in my integrity, never to consult, to commune, to speak, nor to hear. You smile. Can it be at the pain you have inflicted?
Oh, no, no, no! If I smile, 'tis at the greater pain I have, I trust, averted. While conscious that I might, eventually, be chained to another, every duty admonished me to resist every feeling. Yet with hope always, ultimately, before me, I had not the force to utter a word, a baneful word, that might teach you to renounce me, even though I deemed it indispensable to my honour to exact a total separation. Had I confided to you my fearful secret, had you yourself aided the abolition of my shackles, should I not, in a situation so delicate, so critical, have fixed an eternal barrier between us, or have sacrificed the fame of both to the most wounding of calumnies? Ah, no! From the instant that my heart interfered, that I was conscious of a new motive that urged my wish of liberation, I have held it my duty, I have felt it my future happiness, to avoid, to fear, to fly you.'
'I was most favoured then, it seems,' replied Harleigh, with a smile of rapture, 'when I thought you most inexorable. I must thank you for your rejections, your avoidance, your implacable, immovable coldness.'
'Reverse else the medal,'
she cried, gaily, 'and see whether the impression will be more to your taste.'
'Loveliest Miss Ellis! Most beloved Miss Granville! My own! At length, my own sweet Juliet! That, and that only, can be to my taste, which has brought me to the bliss of this moment.'
With blushing tenderness, Juliet then confessed, that at the moment of his first generous declaration, following the summer house scene with Elinor, she had felt pierced with an aggravated horror of her nameless ties, that had nearly burst her heart asunder. With minute retrospection, then, enjoying even every evil, and finding motives of congratulation from every pain that was past, they mutually recapitulated their feelings, their conjectures, their rising and progressive partiality, since the opening of their acquaintance. One circumstance alone was tinted with regret.
'Elinor!'
cried Juliet.
'O how will Elinor bear to hear of this event?'
'Fear her not,' he returned. 'She has a noble, though perhaps a masculine spirit, and she will soon, probably, think of this affair only with pique and wonder; not against me, for she is truly generous, but against herself, for she is candid and just. She has always internally believed, that perseverance in the honour that she has meant to shew me, must ultimately be victorious. But where partiality is not desired, it can only be repaid, by man to woman as by woman to man, from weakness or vanity. Gratitude is all powerful in friendship, for friendship may be earned; but love, more wilful, more difficult, more capricious, love must be inspired, or must be caught. When Elinor, who possesses many of the finest qualities of the mind, sees the fallacy of her new system, when she finds how vainly she would tread down the barriers of custom and experience, raised by the wisdom of foresight, and established, after trial, for public utility, she will return to the habits of society and common life, as one awakening from a dream in which she has acted some strange and improbable part. A sound quick, but light, of feet here interrupted the tête-à-tête, followed by the words,
'My sister! my sister!'
and, in less than a minute, Lady Aurora was in the arms of Juliet.
'Ah!' she cried, 'you are not then gone? Dear, cruel sister! Yet you could quit me, and quit me without even a last adieu!' 'Sweetest, most amiable of sisters!' cried the happy Juliet, 'can you wonder I could not take leave of you, when that leave was, I feared, to sunder us for life? When I thought myself destined to exile, slavery, and misery? Could I dare imagine I was so soon to be restored to you? Could I presume to hope that from anguish so nearly insupportable, I was destined to be elevated, every way, to the summit of all I can conceive of terrestrial happiness?'
The grateful Harleigh, at these words, came forward to present himself to Lady Aurora, who learnt with enchantment the purposed alliance; not alone from the prospect of permanent happiness which it opened to her sister, but also as a means to overcome all possible opposition, on the part of Lord Denmeath, to a public acknowledgment of relationship. Juliet, who, in the indulgence of sentiments so long and so imperiously curbed, found a charm nearly as fascinating as that which their avowal communicated to Harleigh, began now, with blushing animation, to recount to her delightedly listening Aurora, the various events, the unceasing obligations, which had formed and fixed her attachment. A tale which, like this, had equal attraction to the speaker and to the hearers, had little chance to be brief. It was not, therefore, far advanced, when they were joined by Lord Melbury,
who, gathering from Lady Aurora the situation of affairs, bounded, wild as a young colt, with joy. The minutes now were lengthening unconsciously to hours, when the various narratives and congratulations were interrupted by a loud halloo, followed by the appearance of the old sailor. "Please your honours," said the worthy tar, "master begins to be afeard you've as good as forgot him. He's been walking upon the beach alongside the old French parson till one foot is plaguy to put it to wag for the other. Howsomever, he'd scorn to give up to a Frenchman, to the longest day he has to live, more especial some to a parson. You may take Jack's word for that." The happy party now hastened to the strand, but there perceived neither the bishop nor the admiral. The sailor, slyly grinning at their surprise, told them, with a merry nod, and a significant leer, that he would show them a sight that would make them stare amain, which was no other than an honest Englishman sitting, cheek by jowl beside a Frenchman, as lovingly as if they were both a couple of Christians coming off the same shore. He then led them to a bathing machine, in which the admiral was civilly, though with great perplexity, labouring to hold discourse with the bishop. The impatient Harleigh besought Lord Melbury to be his agent, with the guardian and the uncle of his lovely sister. Lord Melbury joyfully complied. The affair, however momentous, was neither long nor difficult to arrange. The bishop felt an implicit trust in the known judgment and tried discretion of his ward, and the admiral held that a female, as the weaker vessel, could never properly, nor even honourably, make the voyage of life, but under the safe convoy of a good husband. Harleigh, therefore, was speedily summoned into the machine. His proposals were so munificent, that they were applauded rather than approved; and, all descending to the beach, the bishop took one hand, and the admiral another, of the blushing Juliet, to present, with tenderest blessings, to the happy, indescribably happy Harleigh. Juliet, then, had the unspeakable delight of presenting her brother and her sister to her uncle, and to the bishop. The admiral, nevertheless, could not resist taking his niece apart, to tell her that, if he had but had an insight into her being in such a hurry for a husband, he should have made free to speak a good word for a young sea captain of his acquaintance, a lad for whom he had a great ghost, and who would be sure to make his way to the very top, since already he had had the luck, while bravely fighting, in 2 different engagements, to see his 2 senior officers drop by his side, by which means he had arrived at his promotion of first lieutenant, and of captain; and if, which was likely enough, God willing, he should meet with such another good turn in a 3rd future engagement, he bid fair for being a commodore in the prime of his days. "And then, my dear," he continued, "when he had been upon a long distant station, or when contrary winds or the enemy had stopped his letters, so that you could not guess whether the poor lad were alive or dead, think what would have been your pride to have read, all o' the sudden, news of him in the Gazette!" This regret, nevertheless, operated not against his affection, nor his beneficence; for, returning with her to the company, he solemnly announced her to be his heiress. "One thing, however, pertaining to this business," he cried, "devilishly works me still whether I will or no. That oldish gentlewoman who is taking upon her to send my niece Granville before the justice! Who is she, pray? I should not be sorry to know her calling; nor, moreover, what 'tis puts her upon acting in such a sort." Lord Melbury and Lady Aurora endeavoured to offer some excuse, saying that she was a relation of their uncle Denmeath. "O, if that be the case," cried he, holding his head high up in the air, "I shall make no scruple to let her a little into my way of thinking. It's a general rule with me, throughout life, to tell people their faults; because why? There are plenty of people to tell them their good qualities, in the proviso they have got any, or in the other case to vamp up some, out of their own heads, that serve just as well for groundwork to a few compliments. But as to their faults, Not a soul will give 'em a hint of one of them. They'll leave them to be 'ticed straight to the devil, sooner than call out Jack Robinson to save them.'
Lady Aurora was now advancing with a gentle supplication, but taking off his hat, and making her a low bow, he declined hearing her, saying,
'Though it may rather pass for a hint than a compliment, to come out with the plain truth to a young lady, I must make free to observe, that I never let my complaisance get the upper hand of my sincerity; because why? My sincerity is for myself; 'tis my honour, and whereby I keep my own good opinion; but my complaisance is for my neighbours, serving only to coax over the good opinion of others. For which reason, though I am as glad as another man of a good word, I don't much fancy turning out of my way for it. I hold it, therefore, my bounden duty to demand a parley with that oldish gentlewoman, and the more so, abundantly, for her being a person of quality; for if she's better born, and better bred than her neighbours, she should be better mannered. For who the devil's the better for her birth and breeding, if they only serve to make her fancy she has a right to be impudent? If we don't take care to drop a word or two of advice, now and then, to persons of that sort, you'll see before long they won't let a man sit down in their company under a lord.'
Then, inquiring her name, he sent his honest sailor to request an audience of her for the uncle of the Honourable Miss Granville; adding, with a significant smile,
'Harkye, my boy, if she says she don't know such a person, tell her one Admiral Powell will have the honour to introduce him to her; and if she says she does not know Admiral Powell neither, tell her to cast an eye upon the Gazette of the month of September this very day 12 years.'
To tranquillize Lady Aurora, Lord Melbury preceded the sailor, to prepare Mrs Howel for the interview; but he did not return, till a summons to the repast was assembling the whole company in the lodging house. He then related that he had found his uncle Denmeath already arrived, and that he had acquainted both him and Mrs Howel with the situation of affairs. The Admiral now ordered the dinner to be kept warm, while he wetted, he said, his goust for it, and then sped to the combat, bent upon fighting as valiantly for the parental fortune of his niece with one antagonist, as for what was due to her wounded dignity with the other. The party, however, was not long separated. Lord Denmeath, confounded by intelligence so easily authenticated of the duplicate codicil, protested that he had never designed that the portion should be withheld; and Mrs Howel, stung with rage and shame at this positive discovery of the family, the fortune, and the protection to which the young woman, whom she had used so ignominiously, was entitled, received the reprimands and admonitions of the Admiral in mortified silence. Nothing, when once 'tis understood, is so quickly settled as business. Lord Denmeath, having given the name of his lawyer, broke up the conference, and quitted Teignmouth. Mrs Howel, confused, offended, and gloomy, was not less eager to be gone, though the Admiral would gladly have detained her, to listen to a few more items of his opinions. Lady Aurora, forced to accompany her uncle, softly whispered Juliet, in an affectionate parting embrace,
'My dear sister, ere long will give a new and sweet home to her Aurora.'
This indeed was a powerful plea to favour the impatience of Harleigh; a plea far more weighty than one urged by the Admiral, that she would be married without further parleying, lest people should be pleased to take it into their heads that she had been the real wife of that scoundrel Commissary, and was forced, therefore, to go through the ceremony of being his widow. Called now, to the kind and splendid repast, the Admiral insisted that Juliet should preside at his hospitable board; where, seated between her reverend bishop and beloved brother, and facing her generous uncle, and the man of her heart, she did the honours of the table to the enchanted strangers, with glowing happiness, though blended with modest confusion. When the dessert was served, the joyous Admiral, filling up a bumper of ale, and rising, said, 'Ladies and gentlemen, I shall now make free to propose 2 toasts to you. The first, as in duty bound, is to the King and the Royal Navy. I always put them together.
Because why? I hold our King to be our pilot, without whom we might soon be all aground. And, in like manner, I hold us tars to be the best part of his Majesty's ship's company; for though old England, to my seeming, is at the top of the world, if we tars were to play it false, it would soon pop to the bottom. So here goes to the King and the Royal Navy.' This ceremony passed. 'And now, ladies and gentlemen,' he resumed, 'as I mortally hate a secret, having taken frequent note that what ought not to be said is commonly something that ought not to be done, I shall make bold to propose a second bumper to the happy espousals of the Honourable Miss Granville, who, you are to know, is my niece, with a very honest gentleman who is at my elbow, and who had the kindness to take a liking to her before he knew that she had a lord on one side, and moreover an admiral on the other for her relations; nor yet that she would have been a lady in her own right, if her father had not taken the long journey before her grandfather.' This toast being gaily drunk by every one, save the blushing Juliet, the Admiral sent out his grinning sailor, with a bottle of port, to repeat it with the postillions. 'Monsieur the Bishop,' continued the Admiral, 'there's one remark which I must beg leave to make, that I hope you won't think unchristian, though I confess it to not be over and above charitable; but I have always, in my heart, owed a grudge to my Lord Granville, though his lordship was my brother-in-law, for bringing up his daughter in foreign parts, whereby he risked the ruin of her morals both in body and soul. Not that I would condemn a dead man, who cannot speak up in his own defence, for I hold nothing to be narrower than that. Therefore, Mr. Bishop, if you have anything to offer in his behalf, it will look very well in you, as a parson, to make the most of it; and moreover give great satisfaction both to my niece, the Honourable Miss Granville, and to this young lord, who is her half-brother; and I also, I hope, as a good Christian, shall sincerely take my share thereof.' An irresistible, or rather an unresisted disposition to procrastinate whatever was painful, answered the Bishop, in French, was the origin and cause of all that you blame. Lord Granville always persuaded himself that the morrow would offer opportunity, or inspire courage, for a confession of his marriage that the day never presented, nor excited. And to avow his daughter while that was concealed, would have been a disgrace indelible to his deserving departed lady. This from year to year kept Miss Granville abroad, with the most exalted sentiments, the nicest honour, and the quickest feelings. My noble, however irresolute friend, had an unfortunate indecision of character, that made him waste in weighing what should be done, the time and occasion of action. Could he have foreseen the innumerable hardships, the endless distresses, from which neither prudence nor innocence could guard the helpless offspring of an unacknowledged union, he would either, at once and nobly, have conquered his early passion, or courageously have sustained and avowed its object. 'It must also be considered,' said Harleigh, while tears of filial tenderness rolled down the cheeks of Juliet, and started into the eyes of Lord Melbury, 'that, when my Lord Granville trusted his daughter to a foreign country, his own premature death was not less foreseen than the political event in which her property and safety, in common with those of the natives, were involved. That event has not operated more wonderfully upon the fate and fortune, than upon the minds and characters of those individuals who have borne in it any share, and who, according to their temperaments and dispositions, have received its new doctrines as lessons, or as warnings. Its undistinguishing admirers, it has emancipated from all rule and order; while its unwilling, yet observant and suffering witnesses, have been formed by it to fortitude, prudence, and philosophy. It has taught them to strengthen the mind with the body; it has animated the exercise of reason, the exertion of the faculties, activity in labour, resignation in endurance, and cheerfulness under every privation. It has formed, my Lord Melbury, in the school of refining adversity, your firm yet tender sister. It has formed, noble Admiral,
In the trials, perils, and hardships of a struggling existence, your courageous, though so gentle niece. And for me, may I not hope that it has formed He stopt. The penetrated Juliet cast upon him a look that supplicated silence. He obeyed its expression, and her mantling cheek, dimpling with grateful smiles, amply recompensed his forbearance. "Gentlemen both," said the Admiral, "I return you my hearty thanks for letting me into this insight of the case; and if I were to give you, in return, a little smattering of what passed in my own mind in those days, I can't deny but I should have been tempted, often enough, to outwit the whole business, if I had not been afraid of being jeered for my pains; a thing for which I never had much taste. Many and many a time I used to muse upon it, and say to myself, my sister was married, honourably married, and I, for I was but a young man then to what I am now, a mere boy, and I, says I to myself, am brother-in-law to a lord. Yet I was too proud to publish it of my own accord, because of his being a lord; for, if I had, the whole ship's company in those days might have thought me little better than a puppy." The repast finished, the pleased and grateful guests separated. Harleigh set off post for London and his lawyer; and the Bishop and Lord Melbury gladly accepted an invitation from the Admiral to his country seat near Richmond, of which, with the greatest delight, he proclaimed his niece mistress. But short here was her reign. Harleigh was speedily ready, and his cause, seconded by Lady Aurora and the Admiral, could not be pleaded in vain to Juliet, who, in giving her hand where she had given her whole heart, in partaking the name, the mansion, the fortune, and the fate of Harleigh, bestowed and enjoyed such rare felicity, that all she had endured seemed light, all she had performed appeared easy, and even every woe became dear to her remembrance, that gradually and progressively, though painfully and unsuspectedly, had contributed to so exquisite and heartfelt a union. Her own happiness thus fixed, her first solicitude was for her guardian and preserver the Bishop, whom, with her sympathizing Harleigh, she attended to the Continent. There she was embraced and blessed by her honoured benefactress, the Marchioness. There, and not vainly, she strove to console her beloved Gabriella; and there, in the elegant society to which she had owed all her early enjoyments, she prevailed upon Harleigh to remain, till it became necessary to return to their home, to present, upon his birth, a new heir to the enchanted Admiral. A rising family, then, put an end to foreign excursions; but the dearest delight of Harleigh was seeking to assemble around his Juliet her first friends. Lady Aurora had hardly any other home than that of her almost adored sister, till she was installed in one, with an equal and amiable partner, upon the same day that Lord Melbury obtained the willing hand of the lively, natural, and feeling Lady Barbara Frankland. Sir Jasper Harrington, to whom Juliet had such essential obligations, became, now that all false hopes or fanciful wishes were annihilated, her favourite guest. He still saw her with a tenderness which he secretly, though no longer banefully nourished, but transferred to her rapturously attentive children the histories of his nocturnal intercourse with sylphs, fairies, and the Destinies, while, ever awake to the wishes of Juliet, he rescued the simple Flora from impending destruction, by portioning her in marriage with an honest vigilant farmer. Scarcely less welcome than the whimsical baronet to Juliet, nor less happy under her roof, was the guileless and benevolent Mr Giles Arbe, who there enjoyed, unbroken by his restless, adroit, and worldly cousin, his innocent serenity. Juliet sought too, with her first power, the intuitively virtuous Dame Fairfield, whose incorrigible husband had briefly, with the man of the hut, paid the dread earthly penalty of increased and detected crimes. Harleigh placed a considerable annuity upon the faithful, excellent Ambrose, to whose care, soon afterwards, he committed the meritorious widow, and her lovely little ones, by a marriage which ensured to them the protection and endearments of a kind husband and an affectionate father. Even Mr. Tedman, when Harleigh paid him, with high interest, his 3 half-guineas, was invited to Harleigh Hall, where, with no small pride, he received thanks for the first liberality he had ever prevailed with himself to practice. No one to whom Juliet had ever owed any good office was by her forgotten, or by Harleigh neglected. They visited, with gifts and praise, every cottage in which the Wanderer had been harboured; and Harleigh bought of the young woodcutters, at a high price, their dog Dash, who became his new master's inseparable companion in his garden, fields, and rides. But Riley, whose spirit of tormenting, springing from bilious ill humour, operated in producing pain and mischief like the most confirmed malevolence; Ireton, whose unmeaning pursuits, futile changes, and careless insolence, were everywhere productive of disorder, save in his own unfeeling breast; and Selina, who, in presence of a higher or richer acquaintance, ventured not to bestow even a smile upon the person whom, in her closet, she treated, trusted, and caressed as her bosom friend; these were excluded from the happy hall, as persons of minds uncongenial to confidence, that basis of peace and cordiality in social intercourse. But while for these simple non-admission was deemed a sufficient mark of disapprobation, the Admiral himself, when apprized of the adventures of his niece, insisted upon being the messenger of positive exile to 3 ladies, whom he nominated the 3 Furies, Mrs Howel, Mrs Ireton, and Mrs Maple, that he might give them, he said, a hint, as it behoved a good Christian to do, for their future amendment, of the reasons of their exclusion. All mankind, he affirmed, would behave better, if the good were not as cowardly, as the bad are audacious. To spare at least the pride, though he could not the softer feelings of Elinor, Harleigh thought it right to communicate to her himself, by letter, the news of his marriage. She received it with a consternation that cruelly opened her eyes to the false hopes which, however disclaimed and disowned, had still duped her wishes, and played upon her fancy, with visions that had brought Harleigh ultimately to her feet. Despair, with its grimmest horror, grasped her heart at this self-detection, but pride supported her spirit, and time, the healer of woe, though the destroyer of life, moderated her passions, in annihilating her expectations; and, when her better qualities found opportunity for exertion, her eccentricities, though always what were most conspicuous in her character, ceased to absorb her whole being. Yet, in the anguish of her disappointment, 'Alas! alas!' she cried, 'must Elinor too, must even Elinor, like the element to which, with the common herd, she owes chiefly her support, find, with that herd, her own level? Find that she has strayed from the beaten road, only to discover that all others are pathless?' Here, and thus felicitously, ended, with the acknowledgment of her name, and her family, the difficulties of the Wanderer, a being who had been cast upon herself, a female Robinson Crusoe, as unaided and unprotected, though in the midst of the world, as that imaginary hero in his uninhabited island, and reduced either to sink, through inanition, to nonentity, or to be rescued from famine and death by such resources as she could find, independently, in herself. How mightily, thus circumstanced, are the difficulties with which a female has to struggle! Her honour always in danger of being assailed, her delicacy of being offended, her strength of being exhausted, and her virtue of being calumniated. Yet even difficulties such as these are not insurmountable, where mental courage, operating through patience, prudence, and principle, supply physical force, combat disappointment, and keep the untamed spirits superior to failure, and ever alive to hope. End of chapter 92. End of The Wanderer, or Female Difficulties, by Fanny Burney. Recording by Roxana Nazari.